Hi, my name is Himanshu, and today in this talk, I'm going to present a new model to explain a well-studied phenomena in sentence processing, that is similarity-based interference. The issue we are interested in is this. Consider the sentence, the key to the cabinets are rusty. Now the sentence is ungrammatical because the subject key is singular and the auxiliary verb is plural, so they do not agree in number feature. But when we read this sentence, it seems fine at the first sight. It seems acceptable. The question is why? Why do we see a grammaticality illusion in sentences like this? So one explanation is this, that there is a local noun cabinet which is plural marked, and this auxiliary verb tends to locally agree with this noun cabinets. And due to this local agreement, we find these sentences as acceptable. This phenomena is called similarity-based interference. Now, one of the theories of sentence processing formulates this explanation in terms of a Cuebased retrieval process. The idea is this, that the auxiliary verb uses a set of retrieval cues to search for an appropriate noun in the memory. So for example here, the subject and the plural cue are used to search for a noun that is plural marked and in the subject position. Now interestingly, in sentence C, the noun cabinets partially matches the retrieval cues here. So as a result of this partial match, a race process is initiated in condition C, and this race process causes a facilitation in reading times at the verb compared to condition D, where cabinet do not match the retrieval cues, right? So the model predicts a facilitatory effect in ungrammatical conditions, and this is a robust effect we find in literature. So for example, these are the interference effects from 11 published datasets, and we consistently see a facilitatory effect in ungrammatical conditions. And the Cuebased retrieval explanation is able to capture these effects, right? Now we can also generate grammatical counterpart of those constructions. So the previous conditions were ungrammatical, but what happens in grammatical conditions? In grammatical conditions, the key matches both the subject and the singular cue at the verb. And what is interesting here is that there is an additional noun cabinet which matches one of the retrieval cues at the verb. Now the cue-based retrieval, which is actually rooted in ACTAR architecture, predicts a fan effect in condition A, and as a result of this fan effect, we expect a slowdown in condition A compared to condition B, where the noun phrase cabinets do not match any of the retrieval cue. So the model predicts a slowdown in reading times at condition A compared to B in grammatical conditions. But surprisingly, we find inconclusive results in grammatical conditions. So sometimes the reading times are comparable in A and B, and sometimes they are faster in A or slower in A compared to B. So we can see this in the interference effect patterns from these 11 published datasets, that there is no conclusive result in grammatical conditions. And the Cuebased retrieval explanation totally fails to capture this range of observed effects. So a well-accepted explanation, the Cuebased retrieval model, totally fails to capture the range of observed effects in grammatical conditions. So are there other explanations that can potentially capture the observed effects? Well, there is another explanation based on the idea of faulty encoding. The idea is this, that the plural feature at the cabinets percolates up to the subject noun in a proportion of trials, and in those trials the subject key would have a plural feature and it would be able to license the plural auxiliary verb, right? So we expect faster reading times in condition C, where we have a plural feature, right, at the cabinets, compared to condition D, where cabinet does not have a plural feature. So the faulty encoding-based model predicts a facilitatory effect in ungrammatical conditions, which is consistent with the data, right? So what happens in grammatical conditions? The plural feature at the cabinets in condition B percolates up to the subject key, and as a result, the plural feature here disrupts the licensing of the verb in a proportion of trials. And as a result, we again expect a facilitatory effect in grammatical conditions. So this prediction is not supported by the data. So clearly, the faulty encoding-based model again fails to capture the range of effects in grammatical conditions. So in sum, both Cuebased retrieval and faulty encoding-based models, which are two well accepted explanation in the similarity-based interference, they are, although able to capture the facilitatory effect in ungrammatical conditions, but they totally fail to capture the range of effects in grammatical conditions. Right. So in this work, we propose a new model which combines the encoding-based and retrieval-based mechanisms in a single set of processes. So the first assumption of the model is this, that the dependency completion between the subject and the verb is driven by a Cuebased retrieval process. But this Cuebased retrieval is preceded by a probabilistic feature percolation from the distractor noun to the subject noun. So essentially both faulty encoding and Cuebased retrieval are involved in deriving the dependency completion process. So let's say in the sentence, the key to the cabinets unsurprisingly was Rusty. The plural feature at the cabinets percolates up to the subject noun key in a proportion of trials, right? So if there are total n trials in the experiment, the representation would get distorted in theta into n number of trials, right? So in these many trials, the representation of the subject noun changes from singular to plural, right? And in the remaining trials, the representation of the subject is intact, right? Now the Cuebased retrieval process takes place on either of these representations based on whether the feature has percolated or not, right? So for example here, when the representation is intact, the key receives activation through both subject and the singular cue, right? But in the trials where the representation of subject noun is changed, the key receives activation only through the subject cue. So that's how the activation profile changes based on the feature percolation, right? So what do we see as a result is this, that if percolation rate is 0, right? So if no feature percolation happens, then representation is intact, and we see a classic prediction of the Cuebased retrieval model. So the model by default is a Cuebased retrieval model if feature percolation rate is 0, right? So it predicts inhibitory effect in grammatical conditions and facilitatory effect in ungrammatical conditions, right? But as the feature percolation rate increases, the effect in grammatical conditions goes towards 0 and becomes more and more negative, right? So this is how the effect changes in grammatical conditions. And in ungrammatical conditions, the effect although changes, but it always remains facilitatory, right? And this is more or less is the pattern that we see in the observed interference effect, right? So we can derive the prior predictions of the model, right? So what we see is that in ungrammatical conditions, there is always a facilitatory effect in this range, and in grammatical conditions, the effect hovers around 0, right? So it ranges from around -20 to around +10. So what we find in grammatical conditions is that the model is able to capture the range of effects from 11 published datasets. The gray band here actually represents the model's predictions, and we see that most of the interference effects lies within this range, right? Which is very interesting because none of the models, either encoding based or retrieval based, was able to capture the effects in grammatical conditions. But this hybrid model uh, is consistent with the observed effects in grammatical conditions. And in ungrammatical conditions as well, the model is able to capture the most of the data points, right? Now we do a systematic model comparison, right? We compare the encoding plus retrieval model against the Cuebased retrieval model, and we do this model comparison using Bayes factors, right? So all these point values here represent the Bayes factor values for different priors on the percolation rate parameter, right? So we choose a range of prior distributions on the percolation rate because the Bayes factors are sensitive to the prior distributions used in the model, right? And we see that the Bayes factor values for most of the data sets is larger than 10. So there is a strong evidence in favor of encoding plus retrieval model against the Cuebased retrieval model, except only this data set where there is an evidence in favor of Cuebased retrieval model. So what we find is that the encoding plus retrieval model outperforms the Cuebased retrieval model, right? And this suggests that the dependency completion process in the subject-verb agreement dependencies is affected by both encoding and retrieval processes. And to be more specific, the nouns stored in memory probabilistically undergo feature distortion, which in turn can affect how retrieval unfolds during dependency completion, right? So in sum, our work shows that the similarity-based interference cannot be explained by either Cuebased retrieval or encoding-based model alone, but a hybrid model combining both these mechanisms is able to capture the observed effects in both grammatical and ungrammatical conditions. So thank you for attending this talk, and I would be happy to hear your feedback or questions on this. Thank you.